Hear the teaching text today from Daniel 3. There are some Jews whom you've set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, your majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you've set up. Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I've set up? Now when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, "King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we're thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated.
Well, good morning and welcome. If you're joining us for the first time or you're here every week, you're in the right place. I'm really glad you're here today. We're in a series called Roadmap for Challenging Times, and we're answering the question today specifically, what do you do when you face a pressure-filled situation? And I want to give you this morning 3 words from this story, this specific story that Brittany just read a portion of for us, that you can use to get you through the pressure-filled moments in your life. They're going to orient you, they're going to guide you, and they're going to help you. Now, this is probably one of the most famous stories in the Bible in chapter 3. We didn't get all the way into the part in the fiery furnace, but if you grew up in church, when I was a kid, that was one of my favorite. Remember flannel graph, anyone? Does anyone remember flannel? Can we bring flannel graph back? That was amazing. You would have this, if you don't know, some of you are like, what is flannel? So there's a big board, and people would put up little one-dimensional figures and then take them down, and you would tell the story, and if you were a kid, you loved it. Well, that was one of my favorite stories, is I can still remember what the furnace looked like when someone would tell this story from Daniel chapter 3, and these 3 men who were thrown into the fiery furnace in ancient Babylon. Here's what the story is. It's a picture of the pressure that you and I face. Now, for centuries, quite literally, this has been a story that people of faith have reached back to understand how it is that they might resist the powers that are trying to overtake their life and, in a way, refuse to bow to them. And I want to offer this story to you this morning as a resource for you and for your life and for your faith. Now, the Apostle Paul, when he wrote much of the New Testament, many of the letters are written by the Apostle Paul in the New Testament, and he actually said a version of this story. He encapsulated it because he was writing to the Christians in Rome, which would have been the Babylon of the superpower of the time. And I want to put it on the screen what Paul said, because it ties into what we're going to talk about this morning. But it's kind of famous. If you've been around, you've heard this before. Here's what Paul said to you and to me about the pressures that we face. He said, "Do not conform to the pattern of this world." Did you know that Christians are not supposed to be conformists? If you thought Christianity was about conforming, no. "Be transformed by the renewing of your mind, then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will." Now, there's a translation of this, the Phillips translation. It's kind of an older translation, and I love how it describes Romans 12:2. It says it like this: "Don't let the world around you squeeze you into its own mold." Do you get the image? Do you see the image? Now, this might be too late for some of you. I know you're thinking, if those of you who love pumpkins and you love to decorate your house when Halloween comes around and all of that, it might be too late for you. When you see this picture, you're going to go, next year. But this is, you can actually buy molds. Did you know this? You can buy a mold, and when the pumpkin or whatever fruit, vegetable it is, it will grow in, and the mold will actually shape and make that. Those are real pumpkins. If you're looking at that like, no, that's wax. No, real, genuine pumpkins genuine. So for those of you, again, too late for this year, but here's a little something for you for next year. There you go, right? What's the picture? Those vegetables, those pumpkins, that watermelon gets put inside of the mold, and the mold determines the shape. It's the pattern, and the pumpkin and the watermelon give in to the pattern. And Paul is saying, don't do that. Don't do that. Don't give in to the pattern. Now, why is he saying that? Well, Paul is talking to Christians in Rome, which is a version of Babylon, and saying, listen, the powers around you, what they're going to try to do, they're going to try to assimilate you into the dominant values that they hold. And in fact, in the Bible, the Babylon, which is where these three young men find themselves, was the superpower of the day, but it's actually the Bible's template for the world. If you know, when Paul writes in the New Testament, don't love the world, Babylon is the template for the world. And so every power has a mold that they try to shape you into. Now, let's make this personal, okay? What if every power tries to pressure you and shape you? What then is the American mold? Now, don't make the mistake of thinking, well, we're different. We get a pass. The Bible says all the powers that are not God's power are a form of Babylon. So what are the American molds, or what are the American idols? What are they? Now, I want to suggest to you three things. I think there are probably more than these, but I want to suggest, I think you might see these and might go, yeah, I think that's a mold that people buy, and they go, yeah, that's what you need to fit your life inside of. I think it's something like this. Money is the win. Comfort is the goal. Agency, in other words, the ability to choose, is my right. Money is the win. Comfort is the goal. Agency is my right. Now, are any of those things bad in themselves? Does anyone want to say, well, I don't want money? Does anyone want to be uncomfortable? Do you want to not have the power to choose? But here's the point. It's just that the values, that mold, can lull you to sleep, and you'll be comfortable in your bed while people around you are just struggling. You'll conform to the pattern of the American mold. You'll just fit right in. Now, let me ask you a question. Is that the goal of life? Is that it? Is that the end that God is after? Is God on Judgment Day going to look at you and say, well done, good and faithful servant. Money was your aim, comfort was your goal, and you fought for and exercised your rights. Is that what God's going to say on Judgment Day? No, is the answer to that question. You guys are quiet this morning. It's like we're going to take a nap. Let's just pause and take a nap, shall we? So here's what Paul says. He says you have to resist. You have to resist, not be conformed to the dominant narrative of the world. It will try to make you bow. It will put pressure on you, and you and I have to resist. So here's this story of resistance, a template for how to resist. Now, these three men, their real names were Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. Hananiah's name, in those days when you named a child, you meant something by the name. Now we just call kids Chad. I don't know what Chad means, but in that day, you would name, sorry for any Chads in the room. So Hananiah, his name meant Yahweh has been gracious to me. And Mishael his name meant who is what God is. And then Azariah's name meant God has helped me. And you don't know those names. I said them last week, and you're like, who are those people? You know them as the names that they were given by the Babylonian superpower in an effort to make them conform to the pattern, into the mold. And the names are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And those names mean something. Shadrach means command of Aku, which is the moon, the god of the moon that they worshipped. And Meshach meant something like who is what Aku is. And Abednego meant a servant of Nego, another god that they worshiped. They were, by virtue of their name, they tried to change their identity and squeeze them into the mold. And so this is a story of pressure to conform and change. Now listen, if you're a human being, this is not about if you're a person of faith even. If you are a human being, you will always face the pressure to conform. And I want you to know what they knew. They knew three things. They knew what was important, they knew who to trust, and they knew what they needed to do. Would you like to know those three things? Now I'm going to condense those things into three words, and we'll talk through them as we look at this passage. Here's the 3 words that will get you through pressure. Number 1, worship. Can you say that with me? Worship. Number 2, faith. Can you say faith? Again, number 3, obedience. Obedience. What are the 3 words? Worship. Oh, you were listening. So good. So good. Worship. When you're under pressure, you need to know what's important, and worship tells you what's important. Now, here's what we're presented with in this text, this passage. We're presented with alternate versions of worship. Now, and this passage is, again, it's a template. It tells us that this is just how it always goes. You'll always be presented with alternatives that you can worship. And so the verse 1 says, King Nebuchadnezzar made this image of gold. Now, if you're here last week, we talked about King Nebuchadnezzar had this dream, and Daniel interpreted this dream. And in the dream, Daniel saw this big statue. Now, I don't know if when Nebuchadnezzar heard Daniel, he went, well, this is a divine moment that I'm to build a great statue. Don't know why he did it. Certainly it was a monument to his ego and to his narcissism and to his power. But here's what he was. He was the most important person. And here's what will happen if you just live in the world for a little bit. Someone important, that is someone with power and with influence, will try to tell you what the most important thing is. It will always happen. Then verse 2 says, and then Nebuchadnezzar summoned the satraps, which is a government official, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, all the other provincial officials. That little phrase there gets repeated multiple times. They're trying to say, this is the group of important people. So someone important will try to tell you what the most important thing is, and then it will be what everybody important does. It will be peer pressure. Now, listen. Those of you who are adults in the room, you think you are done with peer pressure. I want to suggest to you that peer pressure never goes away. It just becomes something like your lawn looking as good as your neighbor's. Have you ever watched your neighbor get a new car, and you thought your car was fine, and then you see their new car, and you go, wow, I don't know, maybe I need to get a new car. I mean, my car's kind of old, and I don't really like it. It's got a spot right over there. Right? Peer pressure doesn't go away. You know that, right? I used to not like this, but I used to not like dressing like a pastor. Whatever that means. But back in the day, those of you who remember, if you were a pastor, and my dad was this way, he was a pastor, is you wore a coat and a tie. Now, I know some of you don't. Send your emails to me at larry.page@firstnaz.org about this, and I will read them all. But back in the day, you would wear, my dad, when he would get a phone call at night, pre-cell phones and pagers and all of that, he'd be dressed, I'd see him dressed in like his underwear, and then he'd get a phone call, and he'd go put on some pants, some nice pants and a tie, and then anywhere he went, he wanted to be presentable, because that's how you dressed as a pastor, and I just didn't like that, and I thought that was dumb, and I was like, why did we do that? And now, if you notice, most pastors don't dress, there's some that do still dress that way, but most now dress like this, so much so, I thought I was going against the grain, that my niece was here a couple weeks ago, and I came out, I think, dressed for Sunday morning, and she went, you look like a pastor. I was like, wait, I didn't want to look like a pastor. What are you talking about? Right? What had I done? I've given into peer pressure. Everybody important's doing it. That's what's going on here. Then he goes on, he says, so the herald loudly proclaimed, and he said, nations and peoples of every language, this is what you're commanded to do. And as soon as and he lists all the musical instruments, he said, as soon as you do that, you must fall down and worship. And whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into the blazing furnace. So someone important will try to tell you what's important. And all the important people will do it. And so you'll think there's peer pressure that you need to do it. And then what will be communicated to you is that you will be important if you do it, and you will be punished if you don't. In other words, you are to give your allegiance and agree that it's right. This is just how it always works. This is a template. So verse 7, therefore, as soon as all these people heard the sound of the horn, all the nations and peoples and every language fell down and worshipped the image. In other words, here's what happens. It becomes culturally warranted. Everyone gives their allegiance to it. Everybody agrees to it. It becomes the norm. It becomes the cultural pattern. It becomes the mold. And everybody says, yep, that's right. Now let's review. So worship. Somebody important defines what's important. And what everybody is doing, what everybody important is what everybody important is doing is what you think you have to do. So it has this power to change people's actions. And you're told, you're communicated to that you'll be important if you do it. And so it gets your allegiance and your agreement. In other words, it tries to tell you, this is worth it. You know that's where we get the word worship, right? Worth-ship, that's where it comes from. It's worth, what's worth it? It's worth it. It's ultimate. So here's the definition, if you're taking notes, of what worship is. Worship is what's important that changes your actions and gets your allegiance. Worship is what's important that changes your actions, that gets your allegiance. In other words, it gets your heart. Now, I'm not trying to argue, especially if you're a person of no faith, I'm not trying to argue that you should worship. I'm not trying to even make a case for that. I'm not actually trying to make a religious argument in this moment at all. I'm simply saying, whether or not you believe it, you already do. You already worship something. It's not about will you worship, it's about what you worship. You and I can't help but worship. Something becomes ultimate to us. Something. You don't get through life without something becoming ultimate. The genus Homo sapien is a worshiping creature. Like birds fly, humans worship. It's just what we do. We're worshiping creatures. Now, here's what all of the scholars say about this passage in Daniel chapter 3 and what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are going through. They say, listen, this is clearly a commentary on the first two of the Ten Commandments. You know the first two of the Ten Commandments? I'm going to put them on the screen for you. I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. Number 1, you shall have no other gods before me. And then number 2, you shall not make for yourself an image, an idol, a mold, and then bow down to it and worship it. You shall not do that. Don't worship anything or anyone else. Don't be tricked. Don't be conformed. Just say that's important. Don't let it win your heart. Don't do it. Resist. Now, why would God say this to us and then put in the scriptures this story of these 3 young men who live this out? Why is it important? I love how Tim Keller defines an idol. He says an idol is a good thing that's become an ultimate thing. Are you following that? It's something good in and of itself. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just that we turn it into something that's ultimate and we say we have to have it, or our life just won't work out if we don't have this thing. And here's what the story tells us, is that if whatever you worship, it like fire will consume you, because in a minute they get thrown into a fiery furnace and they feel the heat of their decision to not worship what everybody else does. So let me give you some examples, can I? Let's just say that you worship beauty. No one ever sets out to say, well, you know what I do is I worship beauty. You know, we used to have the goddess Aphrodite, who was the goddess of beauty. It's never gone away. We just still worship beauty. Look at our culture. Look at the people who are influencers. Are there influencers that are not beautiful? Not many. If you worship beauty, what's going to happen to you? Well, you're going to eventually be burned by the fire of age and tragedy. Now, here's the reality about anything that you worship, is it's inevitable. You become like what you worship. What is beauty? Beauty is fleeting and changing. Just wait a little bit and your wardrobe will be out of style and you won't have enough hair to cover up. No, I thank you for the awe, to whoever that was. Aw. Right? So if you become like what you worship, and beauty is fleeting and changing, what does that mean you become? You become a person who is unstable. You didn't set out for that. You just went, I've got to be beautiful. I've got to hold on to my beauty. Let's say you worship money. Jesus says this is the number one competitor in people's hearts for God, is money. And what happens? Well, you'll be burned by the fire of loss and loneliness. Why? Because you become like what you worship. Well, what's money? It's cold and hard. You worship it, I promise you, you're going to become cold and hard too. Or let's say you worship politics. Well, you'll be burned by the fire of division and compromise. What is politics? We're going to talk about it in a couple weeks. But politics is, there's sides and people arguing, and it is the art of compromise. You have to compromise to be political. So if you worship, though, you say, like, I've got to have the politics the way that I think it ought to go, you're going to be burned by division and the fire of division and compromise. And if you become like what you worship, that means what? You will become a person who is divisive and compromised. Now, why are we commanded to worship God alone? Well, an idol is something our heart latches onto because we believe it promises us life. But the reality is that it takes it. So the commandment is for the sake of our life. The answer to what's important is actually a who. It's God Almighty, the maker of heaven and earth, who does not change like the shifting shadows, who is worthy of glory and honor and praise. Like that's what's important. That's who's important. And when you face pressure, you better know who's important. Number 2, faith. When you're under pressure, you have to know who you can trust. So verse 15, Nebuchadnezzar finds out that there are these 3 young Jewish men, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they get told on by people who are jealous of them and how they've ascended through the ranks. And Nebuchadnezzar, they won't bow. They won't bow. And he brings them in. He's like, tell me, guys, what's going on? And he says, when you hear all the music, if you're ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, verse 15, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. And then he questions their faith. He questions what they're trusting in. He says, then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? Here's what idols do is they convince you that you have to have them in order to be safe, and that no one will rescue you if you don't have them. They convince you that you can't trust anyone, because when you have faith in an idol, what you're actually doing is you're having faith in yourself. There's this word that gets repeated throughout the text of chapter 3, and it's the word set up. And Nebuchadnezzar set up, and then this was set up. And it's a play on words, because none of the words, the narrative in the biblical narrative is brilliant in its word choice. It's not an accident. And what Daniel's trying to communicate to us in chapter 3 is that what Nebuchadnezzar is doing is it's all a setup. It's all a fake operation. It's all smoke and mirrors. There's no one behind the curtain. The wizard behind the curtain's a little man. It's a setup. Now, let's make sure we're talking about faith here, right? You need to know who you can trust. Make sure that we understand faith. Faith is not belief in belief. Faith is not faith in faith. It's not my ability to work up energy in order to believe. Now, I understand that many people believe that's what faith is, including many Christians. Like when they get into the furnace and they're thrown into the heat, there are some Christians who they've defined faith that way. That's faith in my ability. Like, you got to have faith. Come on now. So what they do is they would say things like, and you've heard people, if you've been around a bit, you've heard people like, we bind the fire. We bind in Jesus' name. We bind the fire. We're going to have a prayer meeting at 7 o'clock. And we're going to bind the fire. Or we call down deliverance from the furnace. The worst version of it does things like, hey, send us some money and the fire won't burn you. Faith is not a mechanism for manipulating the world around me. It's not what faith is. Let me give you a definition. You're taking notes. Faith is not an energy I create. It's a person I trust. Say it again. Faith is not an energy I create. It's a person I trust. Now notice what they say in verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. You go ahead, throw us into the furnace, and with the God we serve, he can deliver us from it. But even if he does not, notice what they say. Even if he does not, we want you to know, Your Majesty, we will not serve your gods. We're trying to answer the question, aren't we? Who can you trust? Now listen. If I believe in you, that means that I trust you even if things don't go well. Do you know what venture capitalists? Some of you know instantly. Venture capitalists are people who they find ideas and they find people who are competent and have ability. And what they do is they say, okay, this idea has merit, and we will fund this, and you're going to pay us back at this level. But they put money toward people and their ideas. But did you know that a venture capitalist, read a statistic in the Harvard Review, so it's got to be true. Do you know 3 out of 4 venture capitalist ideas fail? So the success rate is what, if anybody's doing the math? 25%. Here's what venture capitalists do. They trust the ability, the intent, and the purpose of a person. In other words, venture capitalists have faith. They trust a person. And they say, it might not work out, but I believe in you. Now, if a person can do that over a few dollars, to believe in God is to trust God's ability and to trust God's character and God's intent and God's purpose, because I see that God is most important. He's the most important being in the universe. And so I worship God. And in light of that, I recognize that everything around me is temporary, but that God is permanent. So if I find myself in a temporary situation, I don't put my trust in the temporary situation. I put my trust in God's greater permanence. Do you see how these words build on each other? It's worship. I understand that God is most important. And so then I begin to put my faith in God. Do you see that? I trust the goodness of God. Do you see that? So worship, faith, obedience. When you're under pressure, you need to know what to do. Like, what do I don't know. I don't know what to do. Let me read that verse 18. I'll highlight a different section for you again. But even if he does not, they said, we want you to know, your majesty, we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. Now, what are they doing? They are obeying at great cost to themselves. Are they obeying the 10 Commandments? Yes. But they're not just obeying a list of rules like they have to. What are they doing? They're really obeying God. They're exercising trust in God. Now, we have to talk about this for a second, because when I even say the word obedience, I promise almost everybody has this kind of visceral reaction. You're like, ugh. I mean, submission is almost un-American, right? We hate submission. We love and prize agency, right? It's part of our pattern, remember? Now, if you're in some places, it's fine to obey. If you're in the military, you obey an order. If you're in the police or firefighter, you need to obey an order. You know, if you're a teenager, please obey your parents. Can I get an amen from somebody in the room? Nobody as desperate as me. All right, that's fine. You hopefully have a boss who will give you orders and they're good. Now, but even when we do that, trace back that obeying. What's behind it? Well, you have trust in the person. I mean, if it's a righteous order, right? You go back behind that obedience is you're trusting in a person who is wanting our best, we hope, to do something important. You see how that all goes together? Worship and faith and obedience, you have to have them all. You can't just have one. So I've said this before, I'll say it again. I am an equal opportunity offender. If I haven't offended you yet, I will, not on purpose. But let me just say something that might be a little bit offensive. And let me talk to us Christians really directly. Do you know what we're doing wrong? We want people to obey God who don't even worship or trust God. And we're mad about it. Why won't they obey? It's God's command. Why won't they obey it? I'm not saying that as an indictment of those people. I'm saying that as an indictment of us. We want people to be obeyers, and we aren't all that interested in helping them first become worshipers. Are you following what I'm saying? Like, why won't they do it? I don't understand. It's God's law. Why won't they do it? We just want them to obey. And now listen, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they obeyed because they trusted out of their worship. But we know what's happened with us is we've been too shaped by the world. And so we think it's about compliance and obedience, and it's sheer power. It's just making somebody do it. But how do you get somebody to obey? Like, every parent's asking that question. How do you get someone to obey? Well, can we pause for a second, and can you pay attention and see what it is that God does in order to get someone to obey. Maybe you know this, maybe you don't know this, but God wins people, if you're taking notes, by wooing them. Have you ever listened to a piece of music that you love? My son created a playlist when he went to college, and he would play it for me all the time, and he called it his comfort songs, and it was a great playlist. And I when he went to college, I missed him, and I still miss him, and so I said, can you send that to me? And so if you see me at the gym, I'm like listening to that, and I'm like thinking about my son, I'm listening to the music. But have you ever listened to some of those songs and something gets you and something moves you? It's like, and it could be any genre of music. It doesn't even matter what it is for you, but it's some genre of music that does something for you. Like I, in college, sang in the Messiah. Our college choir would sing in the Messiah. I didn't know the Messiah before then, but I've done it ever since. And now every Christmas, I went and bought the Oratorio, the book. It's on my section of commentaries, because I think it's actually a great commentary on the Old Testament and the New Testament. And I get it out at Christmas, and I listen all the way. I'm getting ready to. I'm excited about it. I listen all the way through the Messiah, because it does something to me. It moves me. You know what it does when you listen to great music? It evokes awe. I'm wooed by it. You remember the first time you saw, if you have not, please do this in your lifetime, you saw the Rocky Mountains? Like, they have suns just coming over, and then you understand when the sun's, and then, or you've seen a sunset, and you get purple mountain majesty, and you see it, and you get it, and you're like, oh my word, and this sense of awe comes over you. I promise you, anytime I've been around a body of water, on a trip, on vacation, every time at sunset, my wife and I love a good sunset, and so we'll go look at the sunset. You know what happens around the time of sunset? You've been there, you know what I'm talking about. All these people start showing up. Why? They want the awe. They want the wonder. Now, maybe they don't have language for it, but they're being wooed by God in that moment. Look at this beauty. Look at the beauty of this world. Those of you who have had this experience, when your first child was born, when your second child was born, when your third, just the awe, the sense of reverence that just overtakes your being. It's indescribable. That's how God gets people, is he woos them. Do you understand that? That awe, that's something evoking something like worship out of you. And so what happens when you begin to see the world that way, you go, oh wait, there's something bigger here. There's this deep realization about the world, and you start to understand, oh wait, there's really not that much that's actually important. I know we say a lot of things are important, and we have people who say this is important and that's important, but in reality, not that much. God alone, in fact, if you're really paying attention, Soren Kierkegaard, Danish philosopher, he said, worship is living for an audience of one. And when I have multiple audiences that I live for, I don't know where to turn. Like, where do I get? Well, but when I have one audience, here's the second thing. How does God get someone to obey? If God is worth worshiping, you're taking notes. If God is worth worshiping, God is worth trusting. If God is worth worshiping, God is worth trusting. Now, listen, here's what Christians believe. We Christians believe that Jesus Christ is what God is like. He's self-sacrificial, and he's gentle, and he's tough where people are being taken advantage of, and he's soft where people are hurting, and he dies for his enemies instead of killing them. In other words, Jesus is a leader who can be trusted. I have a friend who says it like this. He says, Jesus came to clear God of a bad reputation. Isn't that good? In other words, you're not alone. At the end of the chapter, in verse 24 and 25, he throws them into the fire, and then King Nebuchadnezzar, I'll put it on the screen for you, Nebuchadnezzar leapt to his feet in amazement, asked his advisors, weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire? They replied, certainly, your majesty. He said, look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods. We spent a lot of time talking about all this, but what's the point? When you go in the fire, God goes with you. So Jesus Christ, when he was tempted by the devil, hey, if you'll bow down and worship me, if you'll say that what I do is most important and my agenda is most important, I'll give you everything. And Jesus, when he was tempted that way, he said, no, there's nothing more important than God. You're to worship the Lord your God and serve him only. When people ask Jesus, what is it that you're about? Like, who do you trust? What do you do? Jesus said, here's what I do. I only do what I see my Father doing. I have full trust. And in the garden, when Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane, when he knows that the cross is getting ready to happen and he's sweating drops of blood, what does Jesus say? He says, not my will, but your will be done. What does he do? And then he lays his own body. He says, listen, no one takes my life from me. I give it up of my own accord. He went to the cross. What's happening? Jesus obeyed on the cross so that you could worship and trust. Worship, faith, obedience. Would you stand with me? I want to pray for